Hello, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Rowlett. And Katie, what's today's mathematical object?
Today's mathematical object is some hats.
Okay.
A collection of hats.
A classic mathematical object. Yes.
A classic mathematical object, potentially hats in two different colours.
Ah.
And I guess potentially maybe other colours as well, but primarily just two different colours. I've got a red hat and a blue hat, although technically I'm going to need potentially infinitely many of each, but we'll see. So this is the foundation of a whole bunch of different mathematical sort of logic problems. And what's interesting to me is some of these are very, very simple that you can kind of just access at a very low level. But I also have very strong memories of being in PhD years at university, sharing hat problems that had become suddenly quite involved and used quite a lot of quite serious maths. So I love the kind of range of these. And I also have quite a strong memory of one of these being the thing that inspired me to go and do maths at uni in some sort of medium small sense. Cool. So to give you a sense of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, the idea would be that you have, for instance, three people in a room, and they've all got their eyes closed, and someone comes in and puts hats on all of their heads. And this is a sort of logical device that the people wearing hats can't see what colour their hat is. And as long as you maintain that assumption, no one's allowed to look up, no one's allowed to take the hat off and look at it.
Nobody has good peripheral vision and can sort of see the brim of the hat or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not a peaked cap, it's some kind of hat that they can't see when it's on their own head. So that's the essential premise of this. And so, for instance, you've got three people, they are told some of the information that they might need. So, for instance, they could be told two of these hats are the same colour and one of them is the other colour, but not which one's which. There are only red and blue hats. There's no sneaky third colour of hats coming in. And the question is, which one of them can say for sure that they know what colour their hat is? And I guess in the case where you've got two of one colour and one of the other, there'll be one of the three people will be able to see two hats that are the same colour, and the other two people will be able to see two different coloured hats. So the one who can see two the same, given the knowledge that that they're not just all three the same colour, can say for sure what colour their hat is.
And the ones who can see one of each don't know which other one they have.
They wouldn't be able to tell. But then if the person comes back in and says, oh, by the way, there's two blue hats and one red hat, that might fix it. You know, that might allow other people to say as well. So I had a play with some of this stuff for a book I've written recently, which I tried to put as many fun puzzles in as I could. And it was part of a series called Kitchen Science. So in my book, they were chefs wearing chef's hats of various different colours. But there's one of these puzzles that I spotted. I think it was my A-level maths teacher just brought this out in a maths lesson once for no reason. It wasn't related to what we were learning, but she just kind of wanted us to see this puzzle. And there were four people. I'm going to have to describe this situation now because there was a little diagram with it, but it's fairly straightforward. So there were four people all facing the same way. And I think it was some kind of, there's an evil villain that's kidnapped them type scenario. So they were all buried in the sand up to their necks so that only their heads were sticking out so they couldn't turn round. This was an important feature. They're either strapped to chairs or buried up to their necks or something. Yep. So they're all, if you imagine them all facing to the left. And there's a wall between the left-hand person and the person next to them. So there's one person who's the far side of a wall, also facing away from the wall, but that's probably irrelevant because they can't see through the wall. And then the other three people are all looking towards each other. So the back person can see two others, the middle person can see one person, and the person next to the wall could just see a wall. And the hats that are on these people, I know because I'm looking at the situation independently, I can see go red, blue, red, blue. And the question here was if one of them can correctly shout out the colour of their own hat, then they all go free or something. And if they're wrong, then something horrible happens. I don't know what more horrible thing could happen than being kidnapped by a weirdo with hats. But anyway, and this one was a really nice one because as it stands, I think they know that there are two red hats and two blue hats, but they don't know what order they're in. So this is important. And the one on the other side of the wall obviously doesn't know anything and they can't see their own hat or anything else, so they can't be the person that shouts out. The person who's just staring at a wall equally can't see anything. Yeah. And the person in the middle can only see one coloured hat, so they don't know much about their own situation. So the person at the back can see a red hat and a blue hat, so again they don't know what's going on. But the interesting thing about this puzzle was that there's kind of an extra layer to it, and I don't know if this puts it slightly too far into the real world for you. I know you're not a fan of puzzles where you have to use the real world, but there is, it's a good bit of logic. So the person at the back can't see two hats the same colour. If they could see two blue hats, they'd know they were wearing a red hat.
Yep.
But they can see a red hat and a blue hat. So what actually happens in practice in this situation is that everyone just sits there in silence for a few minutes, and then the person who's in the middle of the three realises that actually, if their hat was the same colour as the person in front of them, the person behind would surely have shouted out by now because they want to go home.
Yes.
So they must have a different colour hat to the person in front of them, which allows them to determine the hat colour. And I saw this puzzle, I was like, this is such a lovely bit of logic. Like, it's not just... It's, even if you could just work it out from inference, like from what people can see, that's lovely, but it's actually got this sort of nice extra layer to it. And it was one of the things that I was like, oh wait, maths isn't just about like crunching numbers and finding the solutions to equations. There's also this sort of layer to it where it's kind of this fun universe of things.
Yeah, and I think I like that. I think the problem you're referring to is there's a puzzle about a light bulb, and you have to know that the light bulb doesn't just produce light, it also produces heat, and it just becomes this whole messy sort of real world thing that if you explain that, like often in puzzles, like you say, you just have this ridiculous situation where in this case you're supposed to imagine that you can't see under a door to work out whether a light's on or off, but other real world things do apply, and it just winds me up that it's this kind of constrained reality only in certain ways, and you can't specify which ways, otherwise you give away the solution to the puzzle. Whereas the
invention of LED light bulbs has ruined it anyway. So.
Yes, absolutely. Whereas what you just described with the hat thing, it's just, well, if anyone can shout out, then they go free, and then some time passes, and that gives you extra information. I think that's fine, and that's totally inherent in these sort of puzzles. I remember there's one, and I can't remember the details of it, where two people have a number written on their forehead, and there's a dialogue which goes, and they're told something about the relationship between these two numbers, I can't remember, and there's a dialogue which kind of goes, I don't know what my number is, 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 I know what my number is. Because there's some sort of like, the relationship between numbers was, if mine's this, then obviously yours would be that, and because you haven't said that, then I can, I can't remember the setup, but there's a load of puzzles like that, aren't there, where there's a time element to them.
Yeah, and I guess like for a more formal setting, you could say that they ask each of the people one at a time, can you shout out what your hat is? And they say no, in which case I guess it kind of removes the need to sort of guess that that's what you need to do.
I guess so.
A little bit, but I thought that was a really nice thing. And then when I was at university, as I mentioned, we got these slightly more serious versions of these puzzles, some of which are actually really nice kind of implementations of some interesting math stuff. And I kind of wanted to share a couple of these. You can, if you search for hat problems, or they're quite often framed as black and white hats. So if you search for black and white hats, you'll find loads of examples of these things. But I wanted to share a couple of these that I thought were kind of fun. So this one is 100 people standing in a line, all facing the same way by some kind of enforcement medium of maybe
magic,
you've wanted to dig 100 holes or whatever, but you're tied to a chair and you can't turn around, and you can only see the people in front of you. And you kind of have to suspend disbelief slightly, because if there were 100 people sitting in a line in front of me, I'm pretty sure I couldn't make out what all the hats were distinctly. That's quite a lot of hats to see, even 99 people. But assuming everyone's a perfect logician and has perfect eyesight and what have you, and they're given hats completely at random. So they don't know how many hats there are, and they all have to, starting from the back of the line, have to shout out a colour, red or blue. Right. And if they're correct, then they go free, and if they're not, something bad happens. And the idea is that they need to try and maximise the number of people who get it right. And they're not allowed to know anything, they're not allowed to communicate anything other than just shouting out a colour, but they're allowed to have a chat beforehand and sort of strategise with this thing. So I think that's all of the kind of specifications of the puzzle. 100 people in a line, everyone can only see the people in front of them. They all have to shout from the back of the row, like the person at the back shouts first, then the person after. So they all hear all the people before them shout, and they just shout the name of the colour. And if anyone wants to have a think about this and try and get a solution or an idea of how this might work, have a think about it, feel free to pause the podcast at this stage. This is a flexible medium, and go away and have a think about this. But But I'll kind of... So, like, what you would expect is that if everyone just guesses randomly, there'd be roughly half a chance of each person getting it right. So the chances of everyone getting it right are pretty small. But there is a strategy that you can do which guarantees 99 correct answers, which is quite nice. And in fact, the expected number of people getting it correct is 99.5. In a sort of probability sense. So the way that this works, they have this sort of strategy discussion beforehand, and what they decide is that the person at the back has essentially they're sacrificing themselves. They just shout anything. Oh no, they don't just shout anything. What they do is they count the number of red hats they can see in front of them, and if it's odd, they say red, and if it's even, they say blue. So they don't know what colour their hat is. There is a 50-50 chance that might happen to give the right colour anyway, but they say that. And that piece of information allows every single other person to know what colour their hat is, because the person in front of them knows that if the person behind them could see an even number of red hats, that their hat must have been...
Yeah.
Because if they can also see an even number of red hats, then their hat must be blue and vice versa. So then the person in front of them just takes into account that information. So bearing in mind that everyone's a perfect logician and has a very good memory and so on and so forth, in theory, this allows everyone to determine the colour of their hats. So, that's quite a nice little solution. And you would guarantee 99 correct answers, and you might even get 100 if you're lucky and the person at the back happens to look out and get the right colour as well. So that's quite a nice one. And, obviously mathematicians at university are ridiculous. So then the thing to say about that one is there is somehow theoretically a hatter who is the person putting on the hats. Right. They could, in theory, if they know what this strategy is, deliberately make it so that the person at the back loses based on the way that they've arranged the hats. Right. But, the worst that they can do is 99. So it's a pretty foolproof method. The way you can make this more ridiculous is that you could have infinity people, so an infinite number of people with incredibly good eyesight in a room who can all see everyone's hat except their own. And this time, instead of starting, I don't know how you would start at the back, but everyone can see everyone else. All at the same time, they all have to shout red or blue. And the question is, can you guarantee that only a finite number of people are wrong? Okay. So this is another nice one. And I guess if you've got kind of, if you're familiar with, infinities and how infinity works, you might have a few strategies for this kind of thing. But again, if you want to have a think about this, have a pause, go away and walk around for a little while and see if you can get anywhere with this. The solution for this one I thought was ridiculous, and we kind of came to it as a group all together kind of discussing this, but someone came out with this idea. So the idea is that given all the possible infinite arrangements of red and blue that there could be, you can put an equivalence relation on sets of red and blue. So essentially you can take all the possible different combinations there could be and put them into categories and say that certain configurations are equivalent to other ones if they are different in only a finite number of hats. Okay. So the configuration where everyone's wearing a blue hat is equivalent to the configuration where everyone's wearing a blue hat and one person's wearing a red hat, or two people are wearing a red hat. It kind of... There's a huge number of different possibilities here, but you can kind of smash them all down into categories. And within each category, they're all the same in all but a finite number of hats. Right. So this took me a couple of hours of getting my head around to sort of understand this as a thing, because I've just learned about equivalence relations, a year earlier, and was just kind of getting my head around this. So fine, we've got this equivalence relation set up. What they do, and again, I have no idea how you actually do this, but everyone stands and looks around them and they go, okay, which equivalence class are we in? Because any configuration of hats is going to fit into one of these categories. Everyone looks around and goes, oh yes, of course, we're in this one. I don't know what colour my own hat is, but changing what colour my own hat is isn't going to change which class we're in, because that's a finite number of hats. So we're still in this class. So everyone knows what equivalence class they're in, and everyone shouts the colour of their hat in the equivalence class representative for that equivalence class. So this idea, you can set up all the classes, and for each one you pick one arrangement that kind of represents that class.
Right.
And it's just a kind of randomly chosen element from the class, and it has, you know, a specified colour for each hat.
Right.
So you just shout what colour your hat is in that equivalence class representative,
Yeah.
and all but finitely many people will be correct.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's simple, really. Yeah, it's such a weird thing, but it kind of, that kind of works.
Yeah.
And it kind of gives you a sense of how ridiculous these things can get, and you see all these other, you know, arrangements where people can see only certain subsets of other people. You can bring in more colours of hats. You know, it gets more and more ridiculous, but I just think it's a really nice kind of fundamental abstract way of phrasing these logic problems. Like, you've got this assumption no one can see their own hat. You've got the information that people can see, or what they're told by the hatter who set up this scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, get a hobby, come on. Yeah. It's just such a weird thing to do.
You've not got to think about the reality of it, but it's a really nice, constrained, basic, logical world where you can think about logic problems. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it was part of a whole phase that we went through where we were all sharing these and various different things. And other ones, so I think there's one about people who live on an island with different coloured eyes, which is quite a fun one as well. Yeah. And you'll start finding all of these. If you start Googling this kind of problem, you'll find a bunch of them. But like certainly the small ones are quite a nice sort of logical thing. And you can make your own up as well. You can say, you know, we've got this many people and they can see everyone else's hats and they're given this information and what can they deduce, that kind of thing as well. That's quite nice.
Cool. So I'm on Twitter as @PeterRowlett.
And I'm @Steckles.
And as a podcast, we're @MathsObjects.
Both of us blog at aperiodical.com.
And if you want to get in touch, you can email objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.